A very good morning on behalf of Bhangar Mahavidyalaya. Today we are poised to hold the 10th webinar of the series that we have been organizing. Today the Department of History, in collaboration with IQAC Bhangar Mahavidyalaya, is humbled to host the Honorable VC of Vidyasagar University, Professor Ranjan Chakraborty. We welcome you, sir, to the webinar. I would also welcome the webinar presenter and our principal of the college, Dr. Veer Vikram Roy. I would now request sir to please give the welcome address. Dr. Veer Vikram Roy.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Modhimita. We are humbled, as Modhimita has just said, and excited at the same time to have got distinguished historian and Honorable Vice Chancellor of Vidyasagar University, Professor Ranjan Chakraborty amongst us. He will speak on the pandemics against a historical background. Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, as we all know, is a true visionary and a leader who is steering Vidyasagar University from one excellence to other. I welcome him, and I also welcome other participants, scholars and teachers from home and abroad. I also thank at the same time our history department as a whole for arranging such a relevant webinar as this. As we all know, pandemics have ravaged humanity throughout its existence, often changing the course of history, sometimes signaling the end of entire civilizations. We have read about Black Death ranging from 1346 to 1353, which traveled from Asia to Europe, wiping out almost half of Europe's population. Then the Asian flu of 1957 and 58 did originate in China, as COVID-19 is believed to be. In this connection, we may say how history repeats itself. Sir is an authority on this topic. I welcome Sir and give over the platform to Sir, who will engage us in a very illuminating and enlightening discussion. Welcome you, Sir. Thank you, everybody.
I would now request the webinar presenter, Shomnath Mondol, to please introduce sir.
Good morning, everybody. It is my privilege and honor to introduce Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of Vidyasagar University, West Bengal, as well as a renowned history scholar. I have had the extreme good fortune of being his student at Jadavpur University in 1991 to 96. Professor Ranjan Chakraborty is one of the finest history teachers of our time, and with great humility, I cherish this moment of having Sir as the webinar speaker being organized by the Department of History, Bhangar College. It is difficult to sum up the vast achievement and scholarship of Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, but as a custom, I present before you some of Sir's works. Professor Ranjan Chakraborty did MA and PhD from Jadavpur University, is at present the Vice Chancellor of Vidyasagar University, West Bengal, and formerly Professor and Head of the Department of History, Jadavpur University. Kolkata, India. Professor Chakraborty, formerly a senior Fulbright visiting postdoctoral fellow at Brown University, USA, 1994 to 95, is one of the earliest scholars in India to undertake research in history of crime, criminality, protest, and environmental history of colonial India. In 1997, Professor Chakraborty was awarded the prestigious Charles Wallace Fellowship at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, to explore the social and cultural implications of power and the exercise of colonial power in such social and cultural spaces, or sites such as the forest and its animals. He is a former member of the editorial board of a very prestigious global environment journal published from Florence, Italy. At different points of time in his career, he either taught or lectured at Brown University, London University, Roskilde University, Denmark, Center of South Asian Studies, SOAS, London, Australian National University in Canberra, Sydney University of Technology, West Virginia University, Morgantown, USA, Russell Carson Center, Munich, the German Historical Institute, Paris and Washington, D.C., Academia Sinica, Taiwan, and other institutions in India and abroad. Professor Ranjan Chakraborty is an internationally acclaimed historian with interest in environmental history and related areas like history of science and technology. Besides a large number of research articles in learned national and international journals and edited volumes, he has authored Authority and Violence in Colonial Bengal in 1998. Professor Chakraborty other major publications include Terror, Crime and Punishment, Kolkata Reader Service in 2010, Situating Environmental History, Delhi, Manohar 2007. Another book, Does Environmental History Matter? At Calcutta Reader Service 2006. Then Random Notes on Modern Indian History, Calcutta Reader Service. Then Space and Power in History, Penman from Jadavpur University, Political Economy and Protest, and Jadavpur University Journal of History, 2002 and 3. Professor Ranjan Chakraborty was awarded Alexander O. Viescher Memorial Fellowship at Brown University for 2 months in 2004. He was a member of the International Preparatory and Program Committee of the World Congress of Environmental History held in Copenhagen, Denmark in August 2009. At the Forest History Society USA to work on deforestation and wildlife in colonial and post-colonial India. Bhangar College Department of History lucky today to having with us Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, my teacher in my golden days in Jadavpur University. Sir earlier also visited our college in 2005 in a UGC-sponsored seminar in 2005. That was 19th February. That was also kept in our sweet memory. So we are lucky today. A finest quality historian and history teacher among with us today. Now I'd like to invite my teacher, today's speaker, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Ranjan Chakraborty, to present his talk. Thank you, sir. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Somnath Mondol, and thank you everybody. Good morning, everybody. It was a long introduction and very generous one. It was not necessary, Uh, Nevertheless, thank you very much. And at the outset, I would like to express my gratitude to the principal, Dr. Veer Bikram Rai, and also to my former student, Professor Somnath Mondol, who is currently the head of the Department of History at Bhangar Mahavidyalaya. And also, I'm thankful to Dr. Madhumita Mojumdar, who is the coordinator of IQAC at Bhangar Mahavidyalaya. And my esteemed colleagues at Bhangar Mahavidyalaya and elsewhere, my former students who are attending this program today, and also to other distinguished scholars and guests who are also attending. And thank you for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity to speak before this audience and participants. And I congratulate the principal, Dr. Rai, and his colleagues for organizing a webinar on a subject like this. The subject is very relevant. I shall be talking about pandemics in history, as the principal mentioned a short while ago. The context of my presentation is the ongoing pandemic of the Chinese virus. I deliberately prefer to call it a Chinese virus because it originated in China, according to many. You know, the flu that hit India in 1918-20, 100 years ago, it was called Spanish flu in global history. It did not originate in Spain, but it was reported from the Spanish media at first, because Spain did not participate the First World War, and therefore it had no obligation to maintain press secrecy. It was free from uh, the the censorship of press, which went through most of the world at that time. So it was first reported from the Spanish media that people were dying in thousands, and this is precisely why it acquired its name Spanish flu, but it had no connection with Spain. It occurred in Spain, but it did not originate in Spain. But regarding this particular virus, COVID 19, we are uh, almost 90% sure that it originated in China. And China is also responsible for the spread of this pandemic, because initially it could not control the situation very well, and it did not warn, it did not pass on necessary information to the rest of the world so that we can take necessary precautions. So, history is a dialogue between the past and the present. History is a sort of a dialogue between the past and the present. And this is a dialogue with the past. I shall be mostly talking about three pandemics that swept over the world at different points of history. One is the pandemic that occurred 2,500 years ago in the summer of 430 BC in the city state of Athens in Greece. This was the plague epidemic. Supposedly, it was believed to be a plague epidemic. It has been reported that it was a plague epidemic, although we cannot be very sure about the exact disease that hit Athens. And it occurred in 430 BC, in the summer of 430 BC. And pandemic is something which affects more than one country. Pandemic has to be transnational or transoceanic in character. I shall be coming back to this later on. I shall speak for 5 minutes on the Athenian pandemic, and then I shall focus on the Black Death, as Dr. Rai also mentioned in his initial address. He mentioned the Black Death. I shall be talking about the Black Death because it is, till now, it is the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. It killed about 80 million people, roughly about 80 million people in the world. It was a plague epidemic. We have hard evidence that it was a plague epidemic. The disease was plague, there's no doubt about it. And finally, I shall be focusing on the 1918-20 pandemic that swept over India also. And in India, the death toll was the highest. The death toll was the highest. 20 million people died uh, in the 1918 flu or Spanish flu, and India was the worst affected. But we know very little about this particular pandemic, unfortunately. So, finally, I shall talk about uh, certain things about the present ongoing pandemic and how we can take lessons from history. So this is roughly my lecture plan. So let me put it plain that the context of today's discussion is the COVID-19 pandemic or the Chinese flu. I call it Chinese flu. And uh, from this context, we shall be taking a look at the past in order to understand our present situation. Where are we heading to? This question can be partly answered if we focus on history. And this is also one example how history can help us to understand our present society, our present problems. I begin my talk with a quote from the diary, from the personal diary of one of my colleagues at Vidyasagar University. His name is Dr. Abhijit Rai Chaudhary. He lives in the campus, in the university campus, and during the initial phase of the lockdown, when the lockdown was imposed in late March, from March to June, he continuously lived in the campus. And just I read a few sentences from his diary. I've taken his consent. I'm quoting. It was a hot, sultry day of May 2020. A black and white Dalmatian with a leather collar round his neck was seen roaming in the Vidyasagar University campus. The poor dog had a very loving face. The dog was terribly sick, and there were wounds at different places of his body. The dog was disowned by his master. I could well understand this. The ill-fated, helpless animal was crying, groaning with pain. It was a terrible sight, and one would feel very sad. It was, I guided it to our cycle stand and provided some rags to lie upon. The dog obeyed, but it refused to drink water or eat any food. The next morning, when I went to the place, I saw that the dog was lying dead. In good times, his master would have surely provided the support it needed to survive. Unquote. I decided to open today's lecture with this quote because, this Dalmatian dog was just one of the thousands of dogs, ill-fated dogs, who were set free by their owners. There was no one to look after these dogs. They became masterless in a single stroke. They had no shelter, and most of them died. There were non-governmental organizations, the clubs, and other private organizations who came forward to help these dogs. They went without food, and I saw in Kolkata and also in the neighborhood of my university and also inside the university how people cooked food for the dogs and tried to help them out. And it also reminds us, it is a reminder that a pandemic, when you think about a pandemic, the image that will come to your mind is that of the hospitals, the health centers, the doctors with their masks on, the paramedical staff, the stretcher, the ambulance, dead bodies piling up, oxygen cylinders, the smell of medicine. This is the general image of a pandemic, usually. But what goes unnoticed is the total objective condition that prevails during a pandemic. A pandemic, let us try to understand what is a pandemic, because there are also researchers and students who are attending this webinar. What is a pandemic? But in order to understand the pandemic, I briefly define what is an epidemic. Epidemic, what is the definition of epidemic? It is the outbreak of a disease that spreads very quickly in a particular period at a particular point of time. It it affects many individuals, and uh, the skyrocketing of the number of affected people, that is an epidemic. Now, apart from epidemic, there can be a disease which can be endemic. What is endemic? Endemic is, this word is used generally to define a situation where a particular disease spreads in a particular area seasonally, or maybe all through the year. Malaria, for example, if you look at the Western medical knowledge about India, you find that malaria was identified as endemic in, in tropical climates. Malaria, for example, is said to be endemic in South Asia and other parts of the world. Now, what is pandemic? Pandemic is transnational. Today we have nationalities, but there was a time when nation state did not exist. So at that time it was transoceanic. It affected continents. The pandemic I mentioned about Greece, it was not only confined to Greece alone, but it was happening in other places, in other continents. It occurred in Africa, it occurred in Asia, and it occurred in different parts of Europe. So it's pandemic. The Black Death, it also affected continents. It occurred in Asia, it occurred in Africa. So therefore it was transcontinental and it was pandemic. The Spanish flu was pandemic, of course, because it affected more than 3 continents and it affected 500 million people. So it was pandemic. It has no borders. A pandemic is something, the disease, where the disease spreads rapidly to other parts of the world, and there is a kind of a globalization or a global connection, global linkage in a pandemic situation. So that is a definition of pandemic. Now, I'm returning to that point I was trying to make. Initially, the image that comes up in our mind is the hospital, the paramedical staff, the patients, the dead bodies, the smell of medicine, and so on and so forth. But what is missed out is the collective or total objective condition that prevails. A pandemic means, in a broader sense, various things. It means the disruption of the entire society, the collapse of the entire world, the collapse of the normal situation, and the emergence of what we are calling, what some people are calling today, the emergence of a new normal. There will be insecurity everywhere. Insecurity in the psyche of the people. There will be lawlessness, there will be looting, there may be deep economic depression as we are facing today. There has been a GDP crash already, and the growth rate has declined to minus 23.9%. It is unprecedented in Indian economic history. Then there will be scarcity, black marketing of goods, black marketing of commodities, migration. There can be migration from one place to another. And in this case, also in the case of COVID-19, we saw how the migrant laborers travel from one part of the country to another. And it also poses a big challenge for governance. It leads to the problem of social control. We try to understand all these problems. When we study a pandemic or an epidemic, we try to understand such a situation in all its totality. So, in a broader sense, it is something beyond the medical picture or the image that comes up to our mind. Now, India was identified, if you go back to history, you find that India has always been identified by the Euro American world as a place for epidemics. There are certain stereotypes in the Euro American perception of India. If you see the BBC serials, you find that uh, you have the image of the elephant. When they talk about India or when they show India, they show the Indian elephant, Indian tiger, Indian jungle, poverty. India is always looked upon as a country of starvation and poverty. Then, when they talk about India or show India, they show the Indian beggars, the slums, Indian famine, and of course, epidemics. Taj Mahal is also one such stereotype in the European or American images about India. If you ask any European or any American national who never visited India or who has little knowledge about India, if you ask him or her that when you think about India, what comes to your mind? If you ask this question, the reply will be like this: well, it's the land of Taj Mahal. We have heard about Taj Mahal. We have heard about Tiger. We have heard about the Indian fakir. And there are diseases, malaria, cholera, and other deadly diseases in South Asia or Asian continent. It is true that in much of Bengal Delta, there was frequent outbreak of epidemics at different points of history. And if you think about the Bengal Delta, interestingly, we never had a fixed population. We had a transient settlement. It is continuously shifting settlement. There will be floods during monsoon, and the flood will overflow the banks of rivers, and hundreds of villages will be swept away. I have gone through the records of Indian villages in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, in the West Bengal State Archives, and also in the National Archives, and also in British Museum, London. You find the names of villages, but after 10 years, some of the villages have disappeared. They have disappeared because of the flood or because of the outbreak of famine. And if famine occurred, then epidemics would always follow. This was a kind of a rule or kind of an unavoidable situation. And when epidemics occurred, the villages would be deserted. People would flee from the villages, and many villages would disappear. And Bengal, the most important famine in history that occurred in Bengal occurred in 1770, in the year 1770. And this is more popularly known as Chiattorer Monnontor. And in contemporary popular literature, you have songs and you have descriptions, graphic accounts of the famine. There is a graphic description of the famine in Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's novel. Many of you may be able to recall it. Anandamot. This famine was one of the greatest calamities in human history. It was accompanied by epidemic diseases like cholera and smallpox. The mortality rate was very high, and in many cases, the entire village was wiped out by such epidemics like cholera and smallpox. Cholera and smallpox were more common. According to official estimate, about one third of the population of Bengal passed away, died. We have good record of this particular epidemic in the writings of O'Malley, British writer O'Malley, and also W. Hunter. O'Malley estimated that the number of villages declined substantially. There were 6,000 villages in the year 1765 in the Bengal Presidency, and the number declined to 4,500. So there was no trace of about 1,500 villages. All those 1,500 villages were deserted. People left those villages. And instances like this are many in the context of India's history. Now I'm coming to the epidemics. The first epidemic that I mentioned, that I propose to talk about, is the epidemic that broke out in Greece in the 5th century BC. To be more precise, in BC 430 BC. It occurred in the summer of 430 BC, and it was a very critical time for Greece because Greece was at war. It was a civil war. It is one of the earliest recorded civil war in history. This is known as the Peloponnesian War. And there is a graphic account of this war and also the plague epidemic of 430 BC in the book History of the Peloponnesian War, authored by the ancient historian Thucydides in the 5th century BC. Thucydides was an eyewitness to the two events, the war, the civil war, which is known as the Peloponnesian War, and also he was an eyewitness to the epidemic itself. Thucydides himself was infected with the disease. He himself had the disease, but he survived. But the ruler of Athens, Pericles, he expired. He died. He was infected with the disease and he expired. Now, those of you who have no idea about Greek history, very briefly I tell them that there are two main parts of Greece in ancient times. One is Attica. Athens is located in Attica, and there was another city-state, Sparta. And Athens and Sparta, they did not have a very cordial relationship. It was a love and hate relationship. Together, they fought against the Persians. When the Persian invasion occurred in Greece, they combined, they collaborated with each other, they pooled their military resources to combat the Persian emperor. But at a later period, the period to which I am referring at present, when the plague epidemic devastated Athens in particular, Sparta and Athens were fighting a war. It was just like a civil war, as the Americans fought with each other during the American Civil War in the 19th century, when Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States. So it was a difficult situation. The war was on, and the two city-states were fighting with each other. And Thucydides writes in his book, History of the Peloponnesian War, that this disease actually traveled from Africa. This disease might have originated in Asia, and then through Egypt, Libya, and through Persia, it entered Greece. So it affected a number of continents, and then it was an unknown disease. Thucydides repeatedly referred to the disease as plague, but it is doubtful whether it was plague. But the descriptions we have actually indicate that it may be a plague epidemic. Later on, scientists and biologists have identified the disease. I am coming to that shortly. It was not actually plague, but plague is an epidemic, or plague is a disease which was known to the humans since times immemorial. We have evidences of plague even during 8,000, 3,000 BC. About 10,000 years ago, plague existed as a major disease, and it led to high death rates among different populations. We have evidences. So whenever any disease occurred, people said that it is plague. Plague became synonymous with epidemic. It may not be actually plague, but it was customary to refer any kind of disease or any kind of unknown disease and all diseases were unknown given the very backward stage of medical science at that time. So all diseases were looked upon as plague. Plague, today we are using the word epidemic. Similarly, in the past, in the remote past, people would call all diseases plague. And the same mistake actually was done by Thucydides. He thought it was plague because he was giving the description. If you read the book, History of the Peloponnesian War, it is available online. You can, if you search, if you Google it, you find that the whole text of Thucydides is available online. It's very interesting. He says that the body becomes red. So if someone is infected, the body becomes red, and there is headache, very severe headache, and then there will be lumps on the body, and the body would become red. There will be high temperature, and people would become very thirsty. The infected people would become very thirsty, and they will try to drink as much water as possible. There would be stomach upset, and eventually the patient would start vomiting, and the patient would finally pass away because of dehydration, because of severe dehydration. So there is a graphic description, and later on, what happened? The scientists they dug, they brought out the remains, the mortal remains of the dead bodies, and they did DNA test of those dead bodies. DNA study of the dental remains was done from the Athenian cemetery of Kerameikos, and the archaeologists examined 150 human bodies, and this particular graveyard corresponds well with Thucydides' description, and they find the presence of the bacteria Salmonella enterica serovar typhi. So it was not plague, it was typhoid, typhus. And they could not, the scientists, the biologists could not find out from the dental remains, from the DNA of the dental remains, any evidence of the presence of the bacteria Yersinia, Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis, that is the root cause of plague, that is the bacteria which causes plague. But this particular bacteria was not present, but it is now more than certain that what Thucydides described as plague was not a plague epidemic. Actually, it was a typhoid epidemic. And what happened, the people started dying because of certain misconceptions at that point of time. Pericles forced the people of Athens to go back to the walled city. Athens was a city-state. It was surrounded by a wall, and that is the center, that is the capital of Attica, and Athens was surrounded by the countryside. Pericles wanted to stop the people of countryside to come to the capital in order to prevent infection. And what happened, when he locked the entire population of Athens in the walled city, it provided the appropriate objective condition for the fast spread of the disease. Because the density of population, the presence of so many people in a small space, it provided the ideal condition for the skyrocketing speed of the epidemic. And what happens, a viral disease, the spread of any disease caused by virus, that is more fast. Measles, smallpox, they are caused by virus. But bacteria, when bacteria triggers off a particular epidemic, the spread would be less. Given modern medical facilities, it is very much possible to contain an epidemic caused by bacteria, because antibiotics are effective against bacteria, but antibiotics are not effective against viruses. And any epidemic caused by virus, wherever it has taken place, think of the SARS or the MERS or the avian flu and other types of flu, the Spanish flu that ravaged the world 100 years ago, or even the smallpox. Take the example of smallpox. It's very difficult to contain viruses because you don't have any medicine, but you have medicine for bacteria, and the epidemics caused by bacteria, they spread so slowly. And in this Athenian context, the rate of spread, as depicted by Thucydides, corresponds to a kind of a bacterial epidemic. The second epidemic that I propose to talk about today is the Black Death, which occurred in 1347, 1351. It was a plague epidemic, there is no doubt about it, and it is one of the gravest epidemics in recorded history in terms of death toll. The worst uh, case scenario, it is the worst case scenario for an epidemic, and it is the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. It killed about 80 million people. Professor Ranobir Shomadar, in his recent book on migration, COVID-19 and migration, he mentioned that about 100 million people died. If you go through Wikipedia, they say that Wikipedia is never very dependable, and there is a sweeping comment that 200 million people died because of the Black Death in the 14th century. But the actual figure, I examined it very carefully. The actual figure should be roughly 80 million. Uh, if you take note of the lesser epidemics that followed after the major wave, which occurred in 1347, 1351, it lasted roughly for 5 years, and after these 5 years, the plague returned and caused more deaths. If you take all the deaths together, then the total figure can be roughly, if you Google it, you find that the figure cannot be more than 80 million. Now, the Black Death, it occurred, it's a bubonic plague, and it is one of the most significant events of the Middle Ages. And coming to its causes, we find two major factors. One is the movement of people, trade, and the earliest case of the plague epidemic was detected in the Sicilian port of Messina. It is believed that the plague first began in Central Asia and spread to Europe through vast trade routes such as the Silk Road. There was a Silk Route. Many of you may have heard about the Silk Road. It ran all through the Asian continent, and it went up to the Mediterranean. And the Silk Route was a major route, and through this route, the Chinese used to export, they used to run a monopoly trade of silk. But not only silk, but other products also would move through the Silk Road, and it was a kind of a global route. It was a indicator of Asian unity, Pan-Asianism. Some people say that through this route, not only goods but also ideas spread across the world. The ideas spread by Buddha and other important philosophers spread through this particular route. But not only ideas, but also disease and insects, germs, bacteria, viruses also spread through this route. And historians studying the spread of the plague discovered that the disease was spread by fleas. Fleas, a kind of insect or parasites that are commonly found on rodents such as rats and mice. As such, it is now understood that the plague spread via trade routes, as the rodents traveled in caravans and on merchant ships. And the merchants saw that there was a Genoese there was a merchant ship from Genoa which came and anchored in the Sicilian port of Messina in 1347. And the merchants on the ship were suffering from the effects of plague, which included flu like symptoms, black. When they entered the ship, the people from the port entered the ship, they saw that. Sorry. they saw that the sailors were all lying dead. Many sailors were lying dead, and their bodies have become black, and there were black lumps on their body, blood and pus oozing out from those lumps, and they were vomiting. And many of them were half dead. And the ship was quickly taken away from the port of Messina for safety, for the safety of others. And uh, this is one reason, through trade, through the movement of ships. Movement, more, if you are more mobile, then you spread the disease more rapidly. And in this case also, in the case of Black Death also, war was a factor. War was a factor because at that time the Crusade was going on. The Crusade was a religious war between the Christians and the Muslims. And it started in the 11th century and continued up to the 14th century. There were many crusades. The Christians were trying to recapture their holy land in different parts of Central Asia, in the Middle East. And it is said that through the crusade also, through war, through a wartime situation, the disease spread rapidly to different parts of the world. Possibly it originated in Asia, in some parts of Mongolia, again China and Mongolia, parts of Mongolia actually belong to China. China was a part of the Mongolian Empire. So from there it reached Sicily, the Sicilian port of Messina, and from there it spread all over Europe and created a great disaster. Finally, the third epidemic, I'm coming to the third epidemic. I think I have another 10 minutes time, I believe, because Professor Mondol told me that you will have about 40 minutes time. The third epidemic, that is the Spanish flu epidemic that swept over different parts of the world and it worstly affected India. It continued for 2 years. And if you take a closer look at this epidemic, it was a very serious epidemic. And the 1918 influenza pandemic was the most severe pandemic in recent history. It was caused by H1N1 virus. And this H1N1 virus had the gene of avian origin. And there is no universal consensus regarding where the virus actually originated. It spread worldwide during 1918-19. In the United States, it was first identified during the First World War in military cantonments in the spring of 1918. Again, you have one identifying common factor, that is the war. War is a common factor in all these epidemics. The mortality rate was very high. People younger than 5 years old, 20, 40 years old, they were mostly affected, and also above 65 years old. The high mortality in healthy people, including those in the 20-40 year age group, was a unique feature of this pandemic. This pandemic initially was seen in the United States. I came to know about this pandemic first when I was going through the pages of the American Historical Review in a library in the United States. The American Historical Review is the mouthpiece of the American Historical Association. American Historical Association is the largest global body, global organization of historians, and it's very old organization, more than 200 years old. And from this journal, I first came to know that there was an epidemic, a flu epidemic, and the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, which was scheduled to be held in Cleveland, in a city in Ohio, in December 1918, it could not take place. It was cancelled. And it was written in the American Historical Review, the next number of the American Historical Review, 1919 number, that it could not be held because of the epidemic of influenza. As I have some interest in environmental history and also history of science, I tried to take a closer look at the event, and I found that in the last 4 months of 1918, the Spanish flu, as it was called, killed 3,000 people in the city of Cleveland. And that was precisely why 3,000 people died in a particular city, and this conference was supposed to be held in Cleveland, so the conference was cancelled. Then, on a closer look, I also discovered that 20,000 people died in the whole of Ohio, the entire state of Ohio, and 500,000 people died in the whole of the United States, and about 20 million people died in the whole world. At that time, I did not know. I thought that this epidemic only affected Europe and America. I found mention that it occurred in Asia also. It affected some parts of Asia. But I did not know that so many people died in India. Out of 20 million people, 20 million people died. Total death toll was 20 million. Out of 20 million, 12 million, 12 million were Indians. So it adversely affected India. And in India, the 1918-19 influenza pandemic cost at least 12 million lives, if not more. And it is more than any other country. It caused widespread suffering, and it disrupted the economy and infrastructure. Yet, despite this, and in contrast to the growing literature on recovering the forgotten pandemic in other countries, remarkably little was recorded about the pandemic in India. I could not find a single picture. If you Google, you find many pictures, hundreds of pictures from the Euro-American world. They show the concentration, the quarantine centers, hospitals, but I could not come across a single picture from India. Although 12 million people died, 12 million means 1 crore and 20,000, 20 lakhs. Remarkable. But we don't have almost no trace. It has become a forgotten chapter in history. But it occurred only 100 years ago. And this absence of visual evidence is indicative of a more general paucity of contemporary material and first-hand testimony. It's very difficult for the historian to work on this. I would appeal to my young colleagues that you try to take a closer look at this epidemic, because it is important for the historian to understand the pattern and the structure of diseases, because they help us to understand the state, society, and also medical science. We have not taken any lesson from this epidemic of 1918-20. Now, the impact of this influenza epidemic, the Spanish flu epidemic, on India was devastating. 12 million people is a very big number in any standard. And in one state, in one particular state, 915,000 people died in the central provinces. 915,000 people died. And the total death rate in India was more than 4% of the population. If you compare the 1911 census with the 1921 census, if you take the two census reports, you find that more than 4% people died. The population just declined in 10 years. And the total death toll, if you take Great Britain and United States together, the Indian toll was even higher. The Indian death was even higher, Indian casualty. And here also, in this particular case, you find the same thing. You find the movement of ships. In First World War, Indian soldiers participated. Indian soldiers were recruited. They were sent to different parts of the world, to Africa, to other continents. to fight the war on behalf of Great Britain. And when they returned from this war, they brought back the disease. It was thought to have begun with the arrival of infected troop ships at Bombay and Karachi in the months of May and June 1918. The first trace of the disease could be found in the summer of 1918, and it came to be known as, among the people, it came to be known as the war flu. You have the same description. I will not bother you with descriptions, too many descriptions. I just give you one sentence description. This is from Punjab, the report from the Punjab's sanitary commissioner. He pointed out, I'm quoting, he gives a description which is very disturbing. The hospitals were choked so that it was impossible to remove the dead quickly enough to make room for the dying. The streets and lanes of the cities were littered with dead and dying people. The postal and telegraph services were completely disorganized. The train service continued, but at all the principal stations, dead and dying were being removed from the trains. They were thrown out from the trains. If anyone was suspected to have been infected, he or she would be thrown out of the train. And there were hundreds and thousands of corpses. And in burning ghat, the corpses were half burned. They were left half burned. So very difficult situation, and depleted medical service and no treatment available, and there was no antibiotic to contain the secondary bacterial infections at that time, because antibiotics were not discovered, they were not in use, and everywhere there was a terror and insecurity. But very few references or few works have been done on this epidemic. And although it was not an Indian epidemic, but the British colonial government described it as an Indian epidemic. The origin of the epidemic was in United States or in Europe, but according to the British reports, they depict the epidemic in such a manner as if it was an Indian epidemic. India was identified as a kind of uh, uh, as a real place, as the ideal place for the flowering of epidemics. Well, in India, there were other epidemics: smallpox, plague, and also cholera. So it was but natural that all epidemics will have a devastating form in a continent like Asia, and particularly India. So it was not taken very seriously by the British colonial government, and death rate was extremely high among the poorer sections of the people. You have more graphic accounts of cholera and smallpox, but not any graphic description of this particular epidemic. It can be also because the British colonial government, they did not want to give publicity to this particular epidemic because its origin was Europe. This can be one of the reasons. And from this epidemic, which occurred 100 years ago, we have not taken any lesson. We find that we have not taken any lesson. Our medical science has not taken any lesson. We have not taken any lesson. It's very unfortunate that we do not know. We do not know about this epidemic. And everywhere there was hunger, poverty, and there was price rise, soaring prices, and the colonial government was ineffective. It could not really contain the situation very well. It could not control the situation very well. And the British colonial government was of the opinion that no one can control any avalanche. And there were rumors everywhere. Some people would say that it is the war flu. Some people would say that it has been caused by the gas bomb used by the French during the war. All kinds of rumors spread and all kinds of superstitions reigned. For all the immensity of lives lost and the enormous suffering it occasioned, India's influenza epidemic did not seem even to contemporaries to convey any particular moral or political lesson, to be instructive to state, science, or society. It's very unfortunate. And for many Indians, to whatever class they belonged, influenza was part of a more engrossing struggle for survival, subsistence, and self determination. We have only tidbits here and there. We know that Gandhi was infected with the influenza and he survived. It was a mild infection in his case. Then we have some records of this influenza occurring in Shantiniketan, in Tagore's Shantiniketan. Apart from tidbits, there are no other graphic accounts, and this epidemic, this influenza epidemic, was more common among the lower classes, among the weaker classes, but not too much among the elite classes or the upper classes of the society. uh, because of the hygiene, because at that time there was no medicine. Social distancing was propagated as the only way to contain the disease. There was no medicine, and for the upper classes, for the economically wealthier classes, it was possible to maintain social distance, but for the laboring classes, for the working people, it was not really possible to maintain social distance because of their small houses, and their most of them did not even had pakka house. Many of them would live in slums, and the disease had a devastating form in the city of Mumbai and Kolkata, and also in other parts of India, in Uttar Pradesh. Now, coming to conclusion, what I'm going to argue at the end, you see, in all the three epidemics we discussed, there is a role of the ships. Ships make history. Elizabethan ships did make history. When Elizabeth wanted to see her ships powerful, she wanted to dominate the high seas. She wanted to see that England is dominating the high seas. And her ships really made history when the English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. And in the context of the spread of pandemics, we find that the ships played a major role in the spread of diseases. In all the three epidemics that we talked about from history, the Athenian plague came from Ethiopia and beyond Egypt. And from there it fell on Libya and entered Greece, and then it came to the Aegean Sea. And initially it hit the Athenian port of Piraeus. Piraeus was the major port of Athens, and it infected the people in Piraeus. It first hit the major Athenian harbor, Piraeus. And in the second case, the Black Death that I discussed, the Black Death was a devastating global epidemic. And here also plague arrived in Europe when the 12 ships from the Black Sea anchored at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered on the docks and they saw that most sailors aboard the ships were dead. Either they were dead, and those still alive were gravely ill and covered in black boils. And the black boils were oozing blood and pus, and they were vomiting. Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the fleet of dead ships out of the harbor. So here also you have ships had a role. And the same in the case of the Spanish flu that hit India and Europe and the America. It began with the arrival of the infected troop ships in Bombay, in the city of Bombay and Karachi. When the soldiers returned from war, they brought back the disease. And war is a common factor. In all the three pandemics, we find that war is a common factor. In the case of Athens, we have the civil war, ongoing civil war between Sparta and Athens. In the case of Black Death, we have the Crusades, the religious war between the Arabs and the Christians. And in the case of the Spanish flu that affected India and other parts of the world 100 years ago, we have the First World War, the first major war, the World War in the history of humanity. So today we are going through a very difficult period. We have the economic depression, people are losing jobs, and the market is very down. We have the Sensex falling, and we have a minus 23.9% growth rate, which is very alarming. And I mentioned about when I started the lecture about that Dalmatian dog. But the dog is actually symbolic of the entire situation. Dog tells us something. The master of the dog could have been deserted for two reasons. One, his master thought that he may be infected from the animal. This can be one reason. The other reason could be that he faced economic hardship, extreme economic hardship, and he thought that he may not be able to manage the expenses of a pet. So the dog was let loose. But now we need to listen to the voice of nature. I'm closing the talk because I have taken too long. I'm taking too long. My conclusion is that you see, it may also be an environmental crisis. We have to listen to the voice of nature more carefully. We humans are trying to alter. We change the earth. We are changing the planet. We are engineering the planet, and we are engineering it in such a way to damage the arts ecosystem, and this should be stopped. And we are interventionist. We are following an aggressive management of nature. This should be stopped because eventually it may turn out to be suicidal for all of us. When we eradicated smallpox in the 1970s, we never thought that this is going to happen. Perhaps we should not have, some people are saying we should not have eradicated smallpox by using the vaccine. We should have allowed smallpox virus to survive. We have killed many viruses and bacteria, and we have disturbed the ecosystem in such a manner that the nature is now perhaps taking a revenge. So, my humble appeal to all of you is please listen to the voice of nature more carefully. And please stay safe and maintain social distance. We don't have any vaccine yet, we don't have any medicine. So, just social distance, social distance, wash, wash, wash. Only in this way you fight the virus. And if the vaccine does not come, and if any medicine does not come, then we have a very bleak future, I am afraid, because we are that Spanish flu that occurred 100 years ago, and this particular viral flu, it is going in the same direction. It infected 500 million people, and it killed about 20 to 30 million people. And the same thing will repeat if the vaccine does not come within the next 6 months. So stay safe, stay healthy. I would like to thank all of you for attending my lecture. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for giving me this time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Timely.
Sir, we have some questions on the screen. Vishwarup Ghosh. Vishwarup,
Biogeopolitical weapon. I don't know. No idea about this because I am not a biologist. I am not a biologist. I don't know whether it is a natural virus produced from the mightiest of nature, or it is a laboratory manufactured virus. I don't know.
sir, Nitai Gain asking COVID-19, can we call it a kind of Cold War? Was China economically conquest the world?
Good question. Good question. But you see, today the scope of my lecture was something different. This is a political question. It is a question on international politics. It is too early. It's too early to conclude that this virus was manufactured in Wuhan, China. It's too early. We don't have any proof yet. The United States is searching for a proof. The proof, there's no proof yet. But what I mentioned at the beginning of my talk is that China's role was not very transparent. When initially the virus infected people were found, when COVID-19 was starting to unfold itself, China concealed all information. That is the point I mentioned. That is the point I mentioned. But we are not very sure whether it was manufactured in the Wuhan laboratory as a biological weapon, and due to some accident it spread all over the world. These are all stories and gossips. But what I wanted to say in the beginning, when I called it a Chinese virus, because number one, it has its origin in China. Number one, it has its origin in China, and number two, China has a responsibility. China is accountable because China did not take the appropriate steps when initially the epidemic started to surface. These are the 2 points I made. So I'm not getting into those political, international political questions. I don't know because we don't have any proof.
Sir, another question is on the screen. Shivangi asking, respected sir, what was colonial medical policy during 1918-20 pandemic in India, and what was the impact of on the freedom struggle and overall health of people?
Well, it had a devastating impact. 12 million people died. You just think of the number. It had a devastating impact on the society, on the British colonial state, and it exposed the very fragile nature of the medical infrastructure. The British colonial state, it moved in two gears. It moved in two major gears. One is maximization of profit. They wanted to make maximum profit from the colony. They wanted to extract the maximum amount of social surplus from the colony. That is gear one. And gear two is they wanted to achieve this target, maximization of profit from the Indian colony by minimum cost. Minimum cost. They did not want to invest anything here. Whatever researches were going on, whatever infrastructures were coming up in the early 20th century, they were all taking place in Europe, in England. England was trying to develop itself at the cost of India. They have not come to India to do social service. Well, it's true that Christian missionaries certainly took care of the health services in some parts of India, but the colonial health infrastructure was very poor, and the medical knowledge, the scientific knowledge was also very poor at that time. No uh, no medicine, antibiotics to contain the secondary bacterial infections, no oxygen cylinder, no uh, way to stop dehydration of the patients, and very few medicines were available. Yeah, this is another question. How the Spanish flu of 1918 changed India? It not only changed India, the war, the First World War, and the Spanish flu, which killed 20 million people, it changed the whole world. There was a deep economic depression. There was the Wall Street crash at the end of the 1920s. You know, the First World War was the cause of a major economic depression, global depression. And Indian economy was badly affected. There was unemployment, there was price rise, there was insecurity, there was the economic blackout. Uh, Not only India, but it was a part of a global recession. A deep recession set in after the First World War and the flu epidemic. It is all known in history. And certainly, this flu was a major factor behind this economic depression.
Sir, another question on the screen, Professor Tapati Sengupta. What were the general medicines taken giving the affected people in the pandemic of 1918 and 20 in India? Any idea?
No medicine, no medicine available. Only some painkiller and some medicines to reduce temperature. I am not very sure if paracetamol was used at that time, but aspirin was possibly used. I don't know the biologists. If there are any biologists in the audience, uh, he or she may be able to answer this question better. In fact, I am also curious to know. But there was no antibiotic, and I'm not very sure if paracetamol was used, if paracetamol was available, but aspirin was possibly available. Almost no medicine at that time.
Sir, another question on the screen, Shayad Aslamul Islam, respected sir, what are the reasons for the greater impact of the 1918 flu on India? What was the influence of the British government responsible from Midnapur?
Yes, the British government was very much responsible, directly and indirectly, both in a remote sense and as well as in a direct sense. They were responsible because they were here to exploit India. They were not here to do benefit to the Indians. They did not build up good hospital or medical infrastructure. But even if there were good hospitals or good nursing staff, the point is the scientific medical science was at such a stage that it was helpless against this virus. Even today, look at our sad plight. Today also we are helpless against this virus. We don't have any medicine. We don't have any vaccine. So the situation was absolutely similar. Today we don't have any medicine to cure the disease, and we don't have any vaccine. The same thing at that time, but certainly we are better placed because we know other techniques. Medical science is at an advanced stage today. There are various ways. There is oxygen cylinder. There is also other life support systems by which we can help the patient to survive. We have dextrose, the saline water injected into the body. We have good antibiotics to stop the secondary bacterial infections. So compared to 1918, 1920, we are slightly in a better place, slightly in a better place. But coming to that particular disease, COVID-19, we don't have any medicine. We don't have any vaccine. The situation is same. We are saying that, well, you social distance, you use mask, and you wash your hands. The same. The three things were propagated at that time also.
Sir, another question on the screen. We will take one or two questions more.
Yes,
You can see.
Black Death is bubonic plague, and there were many outbreaks, second, third outbreaks of plague, and plague remained for a long time. It continued to disturb us all through the 15, 16, 17, 18th centuries.
Momita
Pandemic,
Datta question.
legacy of colonialists. Yeah, in a sense, yes, because the disease spread because of the war, and it was an imperial war. The First World War uh, was not our war. It was among the imperialist countries, among the colonial powers. So, in that sense, the pandemic was a creation of the colonialists. Now, the last question. Last question.
Okay, sir.
One last question, Shumnath.
Sir. Is there any question? Momi Banerjee, actually, our Professor Momi Banerjee asking a question. I'm not getting
Momi
in the
Banerjee,
chat box.
Momi Banerjee, was she my student?
Yes, yeah, she's a Jadavpurian.
Srirampur College.
Yes, sir. She's asking a question, but I'm not getting it in the chat box.
Okay.
Now, sir, we can conclude.
Wrap it up. You can close it.
Thank you, sir, for your very erudite presentation and how to historicize pandemic. You really crafted on it today. I was getting quite emotional today after a long gap listening your lecture. I attended your lecture on in my student days in Jadavpur University when you taught us on industrial Britain, the public health and crime in industrial Britain. So that was the same line. Now, sir, I'm giving you the thanks, and now the session is to the vote of thanks. Professor Madhumita Majumdar.
Thank you so much, sir. I take this opportunity with great humility and honor to give the vote of thanks. I would thank Professor Ranjan Chakraborty for this wonderful lecture and giving us time from his busy schedule and enlightening us with his erudite lecture, as always. I would thank our principal, sir, Dr. Vikram Roy, who has been like our guardian, who always encourages us in such endeavors. Thank you, sir, for always being there with us. I would like to thank the Department of History, the webinar presenter, Shomnath Mondal, my colleagues across the History Department, Punendu Shekhar Roy, Apuru Chakraborty, Shoma Rai, Rumana Sarkar, and Farooq. They have been there working tirelessly behind the scenes. This webinar had seen more than 900 registrations and participants across Philippines, Algeria, and participants across all the states of the country have been here. Thank you so much for being with us. Without participants, a webinar cannot see its success. So thank you so much for being with us. I would like to thank colleagues across Bhangar Mahavidyalaya. We are like a family here. We work together. And my colleagues across all the departments have been here. Thank you so much for being with us. I would like to thank my technical help, Mohit, who always helps with the certificates and other nitty-gritties. Thank you so much for being with us. And again, taking this opportunity to thank Sir. Thank you for being with us. And as Sir said, stay safe, stay well. Thank you so much. Namaskar.